Welcome to Shadow Frames, where forgotten images reveal their darkest secrets. The photograph appeared unremarkable at first glance. A sepia-toned portrait from 1908, a little girl perhaps 5 or 6 years old, dressed in the high-collared, frilly attire typical of the Edwardian era. Her hair arranged in neat ringlets, posing as countless children did in those days of formal photography when capturing one's image was still something of an occasion. What made this particular photograph stand out was the black cat nestled in her arms. The child held it somewhat awkwardly, as children often do with pets, slightly too tight, the animal's body positioned unnaturally against her small chest. The girl's expression was solemn, as was customary in an age when photographic exposure required stillness and serious faces. For over a century, this image sat forgotten in a collection of family photographs, passing through generations who barely glanced at the unnamed child with her pet. Just another antique portrait from an age long past, until 116 years later, when a team of historical photographic researchers at the Barrett Institute began digitizing a recently donated collection of early 20th century photographs. What started as routine preservation work took an unsettling turn when senior researcher Dr. Eleanor Voss loaded the high-resolution scan onto her computer. There was something about the girl's expression that seemed off, Dr. Voss later recounted. Not just the typical stiffness of period photography, but something in her eyes that appeared troubled. Using specialized image enhancement software developed for historical photograph restoration, Dr. Voss began the standard process of clarifying the image, removing damage, enhancing contrast. It was when she zoomed in on the girl's face that she first noticed it, something reflected in the child's wide, dark pupils. But it was the cat that truly disturbed her. As she increased magnification on its eyes, the reflection captured there caused her to physically push back from her computer. The enhancement revealed what appeared to be a figure standing beside the photographer, a figure that was decidedly not present in any other reflection or in the photograph itself. What makes this particularly unsettling, explained Professor Martin Keene, head of the Institute's Photographic Analysis Department, is that the reflection in the cat's eyes shows something that, according to the laws of physics and optics, shouldn't be possible given the angle and lighting conditions of the photograph. The team cross-referenced the date and potential location, discovering records of a photography studio that had occupied the building where they believed the portrait was taken. The studio had shut down abruptly in late 1908 after the unexplained disappearance of its owner. What or who is reflected in the eyes of both girl and cat? Why does the reflection in each set of eyes show distinctly different scenes? And perhaps most disturbingly, why did 3 members of the research team report the same dream after viewing the enhanced image? A dream of a little girl holding something in her arms, walking slowly toward them in the dark. The Barrett Institute's discovery sparked immediate controversy within the academic community. Dr. Voss's team worked in their climate-controlled basement laboratory, a space typically devoted to preserving history, not uncovering its anomalies. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as researchers huddled around monitors, their faces illuminated by the ghostly glow of the enhanced image. "We need to establish provenance," insisted Dr. Keene, running his hand through thinning gray hair. The photograph came from the Harrington Estate Collection, donated after the death of Margaret Harrington, age 97. The team traced the photograph to Clearwater Photography Studio, which had operated briefly in the industrial section of the city from 1903 until its sudden closure in December 1908. The proprietor, Theodore Walsh, had vanished the same night a fire damaged several neighboring buildings, though his studio remained curiously untouched. Archives from the Morning Chronicle dated December 12, 1908, described Walsh as a solitary figure known for his technical expertise and peculiar methods. The article mentioned his specialization in portraits of children and pets, noting his unique ability to capture remarkable stillness in even the most restless subjects. When Dr. Voss examined the back of the photograph, previously obscured by an ornate frame, she discovered faded handwriting. "Clara with midnight. Final sitting." The words "final sitting" had been underlined twice. Clara's identity remained a mystery until a junior researcher cross-referenced missing persons reports from the era. 3 children had disappeared within a month after the studio's closure. All had been photographed by Walsh in their final weeks. More disturbing were the reports from lab technician James Heller, who had spent hours enhancing the reflection in the cat's eyes. "The figure appears to be wearing period clothing, but its proportions are wrong," he noted in his analysis. The arms are too long and what appears to be its head is misshapen. The girl knows, whispered Dr. Voss to her colleague, pointing to Clara's expression. Look at her eyes. She's not looking at the camera. She's looking past it, at whatever is reflected in the cat's eyes. The team consulted Dr. Sylvia Mercer, an expert in early photographic techniques. She explained that the lengthy exposure times required subjects to remain perfectly still, often using hidden braces and stands to maintain posture. Children were particularly difficult subjects. Some photographers employed unconventional methods to ensure compliance. The research team began experiencing unexplained phenomena, equipment malfunctions, cold spots in the laboratory, and most alarmingly, the dreams. Always the same dream. The girl approaching in darkness, holding something that moved independently in her arms. When Dr. Voss arrived one morning to find all the laboratory computers displaying the same image, Clara's face, zoomed to show only her eyes, the institute director ordered the photograph sealed away. But by then, digital copies had already been saved, shared among the team for further analysis. And in each copy, under close examination, something in the reflection seemed to have moved slightly, as though whatever was captured in Clara's eyes was gradually drawing closer to the viewer with each new observation. The digitization project was officially terminated, the photograph placed within a lead-lined archival box and secured in the Institute's restricted vault. But for Dr. Eleanor Voss, the mystery had burrowed too deeply under her skin to let go. She found herself working late nights, examining her carefully hidden copy of the image on a personal laptop disconnected from the Institute's network. The dreams intensified. Eleanor now saw not just the approaching child but details of a room behind her, a photography studio with antiquated equipment and walls covered in strange symbols, partially hidden behind hanging backdrops. The cat in Clara's arms would turn its head toward the dreamer with unsettling precision, its eyes reflecting Eleanor herself, watching from decades in the future. I need more context, she muttered to herself, rubbing exhausted eyes. Against explicit instructions, Eleanor made contact with Catherine Harrington, Margaret's granddaughter, and the executor of the estate that had donated the photograph. They met at a quiet cafe 3 blocks from the Institute. Catherine, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a practical demeanor, brought a weathered leather journal. I found this when clearing Mother's house, Catherine explained, sliding it across the table. I didn't include it with the donation because, frankly, I thought it contained the delusional writings of an old woman. Now I'm not so certain. The journal belonged to Margaret's aunt, Clara's mother, Elizabeth Harrington. The entries began optimistically in 1908, describing her daughter's delicate health and a photographer who promised a true likeness that would preserve her essence forever. The later entries grew increasingly disturbed. Elizabeth wrote of Clara's behavior changing after the initial photography sessions. The previously sickly child suddenly displayed robust health but refused to sleep, standing beside her mother's bed at night, silently watching. The family cat, Midnight, previously affectionate, now hissed at everyone except Clara, following her with unwavering attention. He sees what we cannot, Clara had reportedly told her mother. Mr. Walsh says Midnight has the sight. The final entry, dated December 10, 1908, contained a frantic scrawl. Clara says Mr. Walsh needs one final sitting. She says they're almost ready to come through. I've hidden her shoes, but she insists she won't need them where they're going. Eleanor's hands trembled as she turned the brittle pages. What happened after this? According to family lore, Catherine replied, Clara disappeared that night. The authorities suspected she'd wandered to the river and drowned, but her body was never found. 2 days later, Walsh's studio was the only building untouched when a fire ravaged that street. My great-grandmother had a mental collapse and was institutionalized shortly after. Later that evening, reviewing her notes, Eleanor noticed something she'd missed in the enhanced photograph, a small door visible in the reflection of the cat's eye, partially obscured but unmistakable. It matched exactly the door she'd been seeing in her dreams. More disturbing was her sudden realization about the photograph itself. The girl's hands, upon careful examination, weren't restraining the cat at all. The animal was unnaturally still, rigid even, while Clara's fingers appeared to be positioning it, like a lens being focused on something the cat could see, and she could not. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. The connection between Walsh's photography technique and the unnatural stillness of both Clara and Midnight gnawed at her consciousness. At 3 in the morning, she found herself in her home office examining 19th-century photographic processes. Walsh had been known for unusually crisp images despite the technological limitations of the era. His subjects never showed the slight blur of movement that characterized most period photography. This technical achievement had been attributed to his custom-built camera and chemical innovations. But what if something else entirely explained his results? Eleanor recalled an obscure text on esoteric photography she'd encountered during her doctoral research: captive light, forbidden techniques of image-making. The controversial volume had been dismissed as pseudoscience, but its chapter on soul capture described methods allegedly used by certain practitioners to transfer more than mere likeness onto photographic plates. The following morning, bleary-eyed but determined, Eleanor visited the university's restricted archives. The librarian eyed her suspiciously as she requested the text, but eventually retrieved the tome from locked storage. "The essence transfer requires a conduit," she read, "a vessel capable of perceiving beyond the veil. Animals, particularly felines, serve as ideal intermediaries due to their ability to observe multiple planes of existence simultaneously." A chill ran through Eleanor when she reached the next passage. "The subject and conduit must maintain perfect stillness during exposure, creating a triangulation between observer, vessel, and that which waits beyond. The reflective surfaces of eyes serve as the doorways." Eleanor's phone vibrated. A message from James Heller. He'd continued analyzing the image despite the project's termination. Found something in the metadata. The digital artifacts aren't corruption, they're moving. When they met at a diner far from the institute, James looked haggard, his usual meticulousness replaced by nervous energy. He opened his laptop, revealing a time-lapse composite of the enhanced eye reflections. "I've tracked the pixel shifts across multiple scans," he explained. "Whatever's in the reflection is advancing frame by frame, and I found this in the cat's fur pattern." He zoomed in on what appeared to be random markings on Midnight's black coat. When digitally enhanced and rearranged, they formed symbols matching those half-hidden in the studio wallpaper from Eleanor's dreams. "These symbols appear in multiple occult traditions," James continued, "associated with thresholds and passage between worlds." Eleanor shared her findings about Walsh's techniques, and a disturbing theory crystallized between them. Walsh hadn't been taking photographs, he'd been creating doorways. "The cat was the conduit, Clara the anchor," Eleanor whispered. "But what was coming through? And why children?" That evening, Eleanor received an unexpected package from Catherine Harrington, a small box containing a single item, a tarnished silver locket. Inside was a tiny photograph of Clara, smiling in a way she never did in the formal portrait. The accompanying note was brief. "Found this hidden in the binding of the journal. On the back, coordinates." When Eleanor turned the locket over, she found numbers scratched into the metal, map coordinates that, when entered into her computer, revealed a location just outside city limits. The site of Walsh's country home, abandoned for over a century, but still standing, according to satellite imagery. Eleanor stared at the screen, knowing what she had to do next. The dreams were becoming more insistent, and in the most recent one, Clara had finally spoken. "He's used so many of us to keep the door. Now there's only one key missing." The rural road stretched before Eleanor, unmarked and neglected, cutting through dense woodland that seemed to absorb all ambient sound. Her headlights illuminated the crumbling stone gateposts that once marked the entrance to Walsh's property. The GPS had lost signal 20 minutes ago, but the locket's coordinates had guided her close enough to recognize the location from century-old county records she'd studied before leaving. Her phone had no service here. James had insisted on accompanying her, but Eleanor had refused. "If I'm right about what this place is," she'd told him, "we can't risk creating another connection point." What she hadn't shared was her growing certainty that she was already connected, that something had recognized her through the photograph, just as it had recognized Clara through Midnight's eyes over a century before. The Walsh house loomed ahead, a Victorian monstrosity silhouetted against the night sky. Unlike most abandoned buildings, it showed no signs of vandalism or natural deterioration, just a perfect preserved emptiness that defied the 116 years since its owner vanished. "As if time doesn't flow here properly," Eleanor whispered, clutching the locket in her palm. She approached with methodical caution, photographing everything with her digital camera. The front door stood slightly ajar, wood somehow unwarped despite decades of exposure to the elements. Inside, dust covered everything in undisturbed layers, except for a single set of small footprints leading from the entrance hall toward the back of the house. Eleanor followed them to a door beneath the main staircase. It opened onto a steep descent into darkness. The basement air carried a chemical odor she recognized. Photographic developers, impossibly preserved over a century. At the bottom of the stairs, she found Walsh's second studio, larger and more elaborate than his public business. A camera stood mounted on a heavy tripod, lens aimed at a child-sized chair positioned before a backdrop painted with the same symbols found in Midnight's fur. The floor around the chair was inscribed with a perfect circle, its circumference marked with strange characters that matched those from the journal's final pages. Eleanor's camera suddenly emitted a high-pitched electronic whine. When she checked the display, every image she'd taken showed the same incomprehensible distortion, except in each picture, somewhere in the background, the indistinct figure of a small girl could be seen, slightly closer in each successive frame. A soft thump from upstairs froze Eleanor in place. The sound repeated, rhythmic, deliberate footsteps crossing the floor above, something small and light, walking with unnatural precision. The basement door creaked open wider. Eleanor's breath crystallized in the suddenly frigid air. Her camera's display flashed wildly before going dark, but not before showing one final image. Clara standing at the top of the stairs, Midnight rigid in her arms, both their eyes reflecting Eleanor's terrified face looking up at them. "The doorway works both ways," came a child's voice, echoing down the stairs. "Mr. Walsh taught us how to use the aperture between worlds. Midnight sees where we need to go, and I hold him steady so the door stays open." Eleanor backed against the wall as small footsteps descended the stairs, accompanied by a strange dragging sound. "We've been watching you through your dreams," the voice continued. "You're the last piece needed, the final reflection." Eleanor fought against the paralyzing terror that threatened to root her to the spot. The basement temperature continued to plummet as the small footsteps drew closer. Each step down the stairs was punctuated by that strange dragging sound, something being pulled reluctantly behind the approaching figure. "You recognize the patterns," Clara's voice echoed in the darkness, "just like Mr. Walsh said someone would, eventually." The emergency flashlight on Eleanor's keychain provided just enough illumination to see the small silhouette reaching the bottom of the stairs. Clara appeared exactly as she had in the photograph. Same dress, same solemn expression, but her eyes reflected light in a way that was distinctly inhuman, like polished silver mirrors. "What happened to Theodore Walsh?" Eleanor managed to ask, her voice steadier than she felt. A small, cold smile spread across Clara's face. "Mr. Walsh thought he was using us. He believed his symbols and his special camera would let him capture something from beyond to serve him." She stroked the cat in her arms, which remained unnaturally rigid. But Midnight saw the truth. The cat always sees. Eleanor's mind raced through the research, the fragments of journal entries, the symbols, the children who disappeared after you. "They weren't ready," Clara interrupted, taking another step forward. "Their anchors weren't strong enough. Their eyes couldn't hold the reflection properly." Eleanor noticed something that made her blood run cold. While Clara's body appeared solid, occasionally the light caught her in a way that revealed a translucence, as if she wasn't entirely present in this world. "You're still between places," Eleanor whispered in realization. "That's why you need me." The girl nodded, her ringlets barely moving with the gesture. "For 116 years we've been waiting in the threshold. Not here, not there." Mr. Walsh began the passage but couldn't complete it. She held up Midnight, whose eyes suddenly blinked for the first time. "The pathway requires a triangle, the seer, the vessel, and the anchor." Eleanor's back pressed against the wall as she edged toward the stairs. "And I'm supposed to be the new anchor?" "You've been looking into our eyes for weeks now," Clara said matter-of-factly. "The connection is already formed. We just need you to take your place in the circle." The dragging sound suddenly made sense as a figure emerged from the shadows behind Clara. The unnaturally elongated form Eleanor had first glimpsed in the cat's eye reflection. It moved with disjointed motions, its proportions wrong, its features obscured in shadow except for eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "The door opens both ways," Clara repeated, her voice taking on multiple timbres, as though others spoke through her. "Some wish to leave, others wish to enter." Eleanor's hand closed around something in her pocket, the silver locket containing Clara's smiling photograph. The metal burned cold against her skin, and in that moment, she understood what made this image different from the formal portrait. It was taken before Walsh's final session, before whatever ritual had trapped Clara in this half-state of existence. "She was just a child," Eleanor whispered, sudden anger cutting through her fear. You used her as a doorway. The elongated figure behind Clara stiffened at Eleanor's accusation, its misshapen head tilting at an impossible angle. Clara's expression remained unchanged, but something flickered across her eyes, a momentary glimpse of the frightened child she had been. "Mr. Walsh thought the doorway needed innocence," Clara said, her voice now tinged with something like sadness. "But it wasn't innocence that made us suitable. It was our ability to see." Eleanor's mind raced through the historical records. Theodore Walsh had specifically chosen children with certain traits. All had been described as sensitive or imaginative in period documents, children who saw things others couldn't. "You were like me," Eleanor realized aloud. "That's why I can see you now. That's why the dreams found me." Clara nodded, the movement slightly more natural than before. "We recognized each other across time, just as midnight recognized what waited beyond." The cat in Clara's arms suddenly turned its head toward Eleanor, with deliberate precision. Its eyes, previously reflecting impossible geometries, now showed something else: the smiling face of Clara from the locket, untainted by whatever ritual had trapped her. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the locket as understanding dawned. Walsh didn't complete the ritual because someone intervened. Clara's mother. She realized what was happening. The elongated figure lurched forward, its limbs moving like a marionette controlled by inexperienced hands. Clara's voice hardened again, the multiple timbres returning. She tried to close what had been opened. She failed. "But she did something," Eleanor pressed, confidence growing as she pieced together the mystery. "She captured a part of you, the real you, in this locket. That's why you've been trapped in between. You're incomplete." The basement temperature fluctuated wildly as Clara's form flickered like a disturbed projection. The entity behind her emitted a sound like static building before a lightning strike. "You need to choose, Clara," Eleanor said, opening the locket to reveal the tiny photograph inside. "This is who you were, not a doorway, not a vessel." "We've waited so long," Clara whispered, her voice momentarily her own again. "It hurts to be between." Eleanor took a measured breath and stepped forward, holding the locket toward the child. "I know about liminality, threshold spaces. They can be crossed in either direction." The elongated figure lunged suddenly, its arm extending impossibly toward Eleanor. But Clara raised her hand in a halting gesture. "You're offering to help me cross back?" Clara asked, genuine surprise in her voice. "Yes," Eleanor answered, "but only you, not what came through with you." The air in the basement began to distort visibly, reality rippling around them as the elongated entity emitted a high-pitched frequency that made Eleanor's ears ache. Clara looked down at Midnight, still rigid in her arms, then back to Eleanor with eyes that now appeared heartbreakingly human. "He'll try to stop us," Clara whispered, nodding toward the entity. "He's used me as an anchor for too long. If I go..." Eleanor understood the unspoken implication. If Clara crossed back completely, whatever had partially emerged would lose its foothold in this world. The entity wasn't trying to help Clara complete her journey. It was using her perpetual liminality to maintain its own tenuous connection. "Then we'll need to be quick," Eleanor said, eyes darting toward the stairs. "And I think I know what we need to destroy." Eleanor's gaze fixed on the massive camera standing in the circle of symbols. Its brass fittings gleamed unnaturally in the dim light, untarnished despite the decades. This was no ordinary photographic equipment. The lens configuration was unlike anything she'd studied in the history of photography, with multiple glass elements arranged in patterns that echoed the symbols on the floor. "His camera," she whispered. "It's not just for taking images, it's the actual mechanism of the doorway." Clara nodded almost imperceptibly, her eyes darting nervously to the elongated figure now moving in agitated patterns around them. "The aperture between worlds," she confirmed. "He called it his masterpiece." Eleanor took a careful step toward the device, but the air around the camera seemed to warp and resist as she approached. The elongated entity emitted that same static-filled noise, more frantic now, and the temperature plummeted further. Frost began forming on the stone floor. "It's reinforcing the boundary," Eleanor observed through chattering teeth, using the cold to preserve the liminal space. The solution crystallized in her mind. Not destruction, but completion. Walsh's ritual had been interrupted, leaving Clara and the entity suspended between states. The camera had continued functioning as a partial doorway for over a century, feeding on Clara's energy while allowing the entity to maintain its tenuous grip on reality. "Clara, I need you to stand where you stood during the original photograph," Eleanor instructed, moving toward the child-sized chair. "The ritual needs to be completed, but with a different intention." Understanding flickered across Clara's face. She moved with surprising grace toward the chair, still clutching Midnight. The elongated figure grew increasingly agitated, its form stretching and contracting as it tried to interpose itself between Clara and the designated spot. Eleanor removed the locket's tiny photograph and held it up. "This is the anchor of your true self. Not what Walsh captured, but what your mother preserved." She positioned herself behind the camera, studying its bizarre construction. The controls were unfamiliar, but she recognized the fundamental principles: aperture, focus, exposure. The brass plate on its side bore an inscription: "As above, so below, as within, so without." "When I activate this," Eleanor explained, "focus on the memory of who you were, not the doorway you became." The entity lunged toward them with alarming speed, but as it crossed the circle of symbols, its form destabilized, becoming even more abstract and fractured. It couldn't directly interfere with the mechanism it depended upon. Eleanor positioned the locket photograph where the photographic plate would normally go, a countermeasure against whatever negative image Walsh had originally created. As her fingers touched the camera's activation lever, the basement filled with a high-pitched keening sound, not from the entity but from the very air around them, as if reality itself were protesting. "Now, Clara," Eleanor called out, "remember who you are." The girl's face transformed, the solemnity melting away as she suddenly, genuinely smiled, the same expression captured in the locket. At that precise moment, Eleanor triggered the mechanism. The ancient camera shuddered to life, with a sound like thunder compressed into a single room, and light erupted from its lens. Not the flash of photography, but something far more fundamental, as if a tear in the universe were both opening and sealing simultaneously. The elongated entity writhed and contorted as its connection to Clara began to dissolve. Midnight's rigid form in Clara's arms suddenly relaxed, becoming simply a cat again, living and breathing. The burst of light subsided, revealing Clara sitting in the chair, Midnight now purring contentedly in her lap. The difference was immediate and profound. Her form had solidified, the translucence replaced by the solid presence of a real child. Her eyes no longer reflected impossible geometries, but shone with natural childlike wonder. "It's warm again," she whispered, touching her own face in astonishment. "I can feel properly." The elongated entity, however, had not disappeared. Untethered from Clara, it flailed with increasing desperation, its form becoming more abstract with each passing second. The basement walls seemed to warp around it as it tried to maintain its fragile connection to reality. "It's looking for a new anchor," Eleanor warned, backing away from the camera. "We need to leave, now." She extended her hand to Clara, who stood with surprising steadiness. The girl clutched Midnight close, the cat's eyes alert, but now reflecting nothing more than the dim basement light. Together they moved toward the stairs, but the entity blocked their path, its limbs stretching across the room like liquid shadow. "It can't follow us past the threshold," Clara said with unexpected certainty. "Mr. Walsh designed the doorway to be one-directional. That's why it needed me stuck between. I was the only exception." The entity lunged toward them, but instead of attacking, it reached for the camera with distorted appendages. Eleanor understood with horrifying clarity. It was trying to reset the mechanism, to re-establish the doorway before its connection faded completely. "The journal," Eleanor gasped in realization. "Your mother didn't just interrupt the ritual, she reversed part of it." The missing pages contained the countermeasure. The temperature in the basement fluctuated wildly as the entity made contact with the camera. The ancient device began to vibrate, its brass fittings humming with building energy. The symbols on the floor illuminated one by one, the circle reconnecting. "We have to destroy it," Eleanor said, "or it will just find another child to use." Clara's face hardened with determination beyond her years. "Not the camera," she corrected. "The lens. It's the actual doorway. Everything else is just mechanism." The entity's distorted form began to stabilize as the camera's power built, the partial doorway reopening. With sudden decision, Clara released Midnight, who bounded up the stairs with feline agility. She then reached into her pocket and withdrew something Eleanor hadn't noticed before, a small brass key. "My mother gave me this before the final sitting," Clara explained, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. She said if things went wrong, to use it on the heart of the machine. The central lens of the camera contained a small keyhole, nearly invisible among the elaborate brass fittings. As the entity edged closer to full manifestation, Clara darted forward with unexpected speed, inserting the key before Eleanor could stop her. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The lens fractured along perfect geometric lines, the crack spreading outward in patterns matching the floor symbols. The entity emitted a sound beyond human hearing that nevertheless pressed painfully against Eleanor's consciousness. "Run!" Clara shouted, grabbing Eleanor's hand and pulling her toward the stairs as the camera imploded, collapsing inward like a small star going nova. The ancient camera collapsed into itself with a sound like glass bells shattering underwater. Eleanor and Clara raced up the stairs, midnight bounding ahead of them as the basement behind them warped and twisted. The wooden steps creaked beneath their feet, threatening to give way as reality itself seemed to bend. They burst through the front door into the cool night air, not stopping until they reached Eleanor's car. Only then did they turn to look back at the house. The Victorian structure remained standing, but visible distortions rippled across its surface, like heat waves on summer asphalt. "It's still collapsing," Clara whispered, clutching midnight to her chest. The doorway wasn't just in the basement. It was connected to the entire property. Eleanor fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking. "What happens when a doorway between worlds collapses?" "It depends which side you're on when it happens," Clara replied with unsettling certainty. "We're on the right side now." As they drove away, Eleanor glimpsed the house in her rearview mirror. For a moment, it appeared to fold inward like origami being unmade, before settling back into an ordinary abandoned structure. She knew that anyone visiting the site from now on would find nothing but a derelict building, its paranormal properties sealed away. "What happens to you now?" Eleanor asked, glancing at Clara, who sat stroking midnight with a peaceful expression. "You're from 1908. This world will be overwhelming." Clara smiled, the expression transforming her solemn features into those of an ordinary child. "Time works differently in liminal spaces. For me, it's been both an eternity and a single moment since Mr. Walsh took my photograph. I've been watching the world change through the reflections." They drove in silence for several miles before Clara spoke again. "My mother knew what Mr. Walsh was doing. That's why she gave me the key. She worked as his assistant before I was born and recognized the symbols when they began appearing in his studio. She couldn't stop him directly. He had protections, but she found a way to sabotage his ritual." "Is that why she hid your locket in the journal?" Eleanor asked. "She knew someone would need to finish what she started." Clara nodded. "Someone who could see, like me." As they approached the city limits, streetlights illuminating the car's interior, Eleanor noticed something troubling. Clara's outline remained solid, but in certain angles of light, her shadow appeared subtly wrong. Too sharp in some places, too diffuse in others. "You're not fully anchored here, are you?" Eleanor asked quietly. Clara's eyes, momentarily reflecting the dashboard lights too intensely, met Eleanor's. "No. The doorway is closed, but I don't entirely belong in this time. I need something else to complete the transition." Midnight, curled on Clara's lap, suddenly raised his head and meowed loudly, staring at something ahead on the dark road. Eleanor slowed the car, squinting through the windshield. A figure stood at the roadside, an elderly woman with a familiar face, though Eleanor had never met her. "Margaret Harrington," Clara whispered in astonishment. "My little sister." The impossible figure of a woman who had died weeks earlier raised her hand in greeting. Her ancient eyes filled with recognition and something like relief. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place in Eleanor's mind. This wasn't about closing a doorway at all. It was about opening the right one. The reunion on the roadside transcended ordinary human experience. Clara approached the ghostly form of her sister, a woman who had lived an entire lifetime during Clara's suspension between worlds, with tentative wonder. Margaret's spectral hands trembled as they reached for her long-lost sister, their fingers passing through each other like mist. "I tried to find you," Margaret's voice wavered. "Mother never stopped searching until they took her away. I continued after, all my life." Eleanor watched this impossible exchange, understanding dawning. Margaret hadn't simply died weeks earlier. She had purposefully released her connection to this world, creating the final bridge Clara needed. Death itself had become a threshold space between the sisters. The photograph collection wasn't donated by accident. Eleanor realized aloud. You arranged everything, knowing someone would eventually see what was captured in those eyes. Margaret's translucent form nodded. I recognized your name from university publications on photographic preservation. Your articles mentioned seeing patterns others missed. I knew you'd be the one to help her cross over, in whichever direction was needed. Midnight leapt from Clara's arms to whine between the sisters, somehow able to make physical contact with both the living girl and the spirit. The cat's role as conduit between worlds remained undiminished. I can't stay in this time, Clara said, looking back at Eleanor with sad certainty. The doorway closed, but I'm still tethered to my own era. I need to go forward or back to somewhere I belong. Eleanor approached cautiously. The Institute has all of Walsh's research now. Maybe we could— No, Clara interrupted firmly. No more doorways. They're too dangerous, too easily corrupted. She gestured toward Margaret. But natural transitions exist. My sister found one. Margaret extended her hand toward Clara again. Family is the strongest anchor. I can guide you through, but you must choose where you're going. Clara knelt to stroke Midnight one last time. He always knew. Cats understand thresholds better than humans ever could. She straightened and faced Eleanor. Will you take care of him? He deserves a normal life after everything. Eleanor nodded, throat tight with unexpected emotion. What about the others? The children Walsh photographed? They're waiting, Margaret answered, her form growing more distinct as Clara's began to subtly fade. They've been waiting for Clara to find them and lead them home. As the sisters joined hands, finally making contact as Clara shifted further from physical reality, the air around them shimmered with soft, approaching lights. Eleanor recognized them instinctively as the other lost children, gathered at this unlikely crossroads between worlds. Document everything, Clara called to Eleanor, her voice gaining an echoing quality. But keep the photographs locked away. Some reflections should remain unseen. The gathering of lights surrounding the sisters intensified, creating a momentary doorway of pure luminescence. Eleanor shielded her eyes against the brightness. When she looked again, the roadside stood empty, except for Midnight, sitting calmly as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. The cat blinked at her with perfectly ordinary eyes that reflected nothing but starlight. The image of Clara and Margaret vanishing into that luminous threshold haunted Eleanor for months. She'd returned to that stretch of road, sometimes sitting for hours in her parked car, but the doorway never reappeared. Midnight had become her constant companion, an ordinary house cat in every measurable way, except for his habit of staring intently at empty corners of her apartment. The Barrett Institute handled the aftermath with institutional precision. Dr. Keene orchestrated a classified containment protocol for Walsh's photographs, while publicly dismissing the entire affair as digital artifacts combined with researcher fatigue. The image of Clara and her cat was sealed in the Institute's deepest vault, alongside other items deemed anomalous but unverifiable. But Eleanor couldn't let it go. She spent her evenings cataloging everything she'd witnessed, creating a meticulous record that she kept separate from official Institute archives. Something about Clara's final instruction, document everything, suggested the child had understood more than she'd revealed. 6 months after that night on the roadside, Eleanor received an envelope containing a single sheet of yellowed paper. The letter bore no return address, but the handwriting matched Elizabeth Harrington's journal exactly. The paper had been dated December 11th, 1908, the day after Clara disappeared. I understand now what Theodore attempted, Elizabeth had written. Not possession or conjuring, but transformation. He believed the boundaries between worlds were permeable through properly focused observation. The camera doesn't capture images, it creates connections. Clara wasn't his victim, but his successor. He chose children who could already perceive what he called the thinness between. My daughter's ability exceeded his expectations. She saw too much, too clearly. Whatever waited on the other side recognized her in return. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read the final paragraph. I've hidden the key that locks his mechanism, but the principles remain. Light, reflection, the observer and the observed. These are the components of reality itself. Walsh merely rediscovered what ancient cultures once knew, that seeing and being seen creates bridges. Clara told me something before she left. The cat understands that all places are one place, viewed from different windows. I believe my child is not lost, but transformed. She has become the doorway itself. That night, Eleanor awoke to find Midnight sitting at the foot of her bed, his posture unnaturally erect. In the darkness, his eyes reflected pinpoints of light that couldn't possibly exist in her unlit bedroom. "She's watching, isn't she?" Eleanor whispered. The cat blinked once, slowly. Eleanor reached for her notebook, adding this observation to her growing documentation. She understood now that Clara's instruction wasn't merely about record-keeping. It was about maintaining awareness of the threshold spaces that existed all around them, hidden in plain sight. The Barrett Institute would never fully comprehend what they had discovered. They sought to contain anomalies, to lock away mysteries in lead-lined boxes. But Eleanor had glimpsed the truth through Clara's eyes. Reality itself was more permeable than science acknowledged, and sometimes the most ordinary vessels, a child, a cat, a photograph, could become extraordinary conduits. Midnight stretched and jumped from the bed, padding to Eleanor's study, where the moonlight illuminated Walsh's journal notes. As Eleanor followed, she noticed the cat's shadow on the wall, slightly too large, slightly wrong in its proportions, as if something else moved within it. Eleanor found herself increasingly reluctant to return her findings to the Institute, while she maintained her professional demeanor during working hours, cataloging innocuous 19th-century photographs and preparing conservation reports. Her evenings belonged to a different pursuit entirely. Her small home office had transformed into an unofficial research center on Theodore Walsh and liminal photography. The walls bore timeline charts connecting Walsh to other historical figures who had experimented with similar concepts. A 19th-century French astronomer who claimed to photograph celestial intelligences. A Japanese monk who created images that allegedly caused viewers to experience memories not their own. A Viennese physician whose glass plate negatives shattered when attempts were made to destroy them. "They were all working toward the same understanding," she murmured to Midnight, who watched from his perch atop a bookshelf. "That observation itself is an act of creation." The cat's tail twitched in what Eleanor had come to recognize as acknowledgement. Since the night on the roadside, Midnight had displayed an uncanny intelligence that went beyond normal feline behavior. He would arrange her research notes into meaningful patterns while she slept. Sometimes she would wake to find books open to precisely the passages she needed to read. Eleanor's telephone rang, startling her from contemplation. Catherine Harrington's voice sounded strained on the other end. "You need to come to Mother's house immediately," she said without preamble. "The workers renovating the attic found something bricked up in the chimney. I think it's Walsh's camera." Eleanor froze. "That's impossible. I saw it collapse into itself." "Nevertheless," Catherine replied, "there's an antique camera here with symbols matching your descriptions." And Eleanor, it's warm to the touch. The implications sent a chill through her. If the camera had somehow reconstructed itself in a different location. She glanced at Midnight, who was now sitting alertly, ears forward. "Don't let anyone touch it," Eleanor instructed. "I'll be there within the hour." As she gathered her equipment, Eleanor considered what Clara had said about doorways. Not that they closed permanently, but that they relocated. The collapse she witnessed hadn't destroyed the threshold. It had simply moved it elsewhere. Midnight refused to enter his carrier, instead leaping onto her shoulder as she headed for the door. Eleanor didn't argue. The cat's instincts had proven more reliable than any scientific instrument. The drive to Margaret Harrington's Victorian home felt longer than its actual 20 minutes. As Eleanor pulled into the circular driveway, she noticed an unusual quality to the afternoon light. Colors seemed oversaturated, shadows too sharply defined, the characteristic visual distortion of liminal spaces. Catherine met her at the door, her normally composed demeanor visibly shaken. "It started making noise 10 minutes ago," she whispered. "A sound like breathing." They climbed to the attic where two construction workers stood awkwardly by the exposed chimney. One man's face was ashen, his hands trembling slightly. "It moved," he insisted as they approached. Nobody touched it, but the lens. It rotated on its own. The camera rested on a drop cloth, its brass fittings gleaming despite decades of concealment. The configuration was identical to Walsh's device, but the wooden body appeared newer somehow, as though it had been recently polished. Midnight leapt from Eleanor's shoulder, circling the camera with careful deliberation. When he completed his third circuit, he sat facing the lens and emitted a sound unlike any typical cat vocalization, a precise tone that resonated with the camera's brass elements. The lens aperture contracted slightly in response. The aperture's response to Midnight's call chilled Eleanor to her core. It confirmed her growing suspicion. The camera wasn't merely an artifact, but something alive, conscious in ways science couldn't categorize. Catherine and the workers backed away instinctively as the lens continued to contract and expand in rhythmic pulses. "It's communicating," Eleanor whispered, kneeling beside Midnight while maintaining a careful distance from the device. "The aperture functions like a pupil. It's watching us." She noticed small glass plates stacked near the camera, each bearing the same strange symbols etched into their corners. These weren't ordinary photographic plates, but something more akin to calibration devices. Eleanor recognized the configuration from Walsh's notes. They were keyed to specific frequencies of light and darkness. "This was Elizabeth's doing," Catherine said, picking up a small leather-bound book that had been placed beneath the camera. "Look at the inscription." The faded handwriting inside the cover read, "Should Walsh's eye ever reopen, these plates will blind it temporarily. The final plate must remain wrapped until needed." Below this warning was a series of dates, regular intervals spanning more than a century. The last date just 3 weeks ago. Your mother was maintaining this, Eleanor realized, checking it throughout her life, making sure it remained dormant. Catherine nodded grimly. "And now the responsibility falls to us." As if responding to this acknowledgement, the camera emitted a low humming sound. The temperature in the attic dropped sharply, their breath becoming visible in the suddenly frigid air. The lens aperture opened fully, its dark center seeming to extend deeper than physically possible. Midnight arched his back, fur standing on end, and positioned himself between Eleanor and the camera. His shadow stretched disproportionately across the floor, taking on that now familiar wrongness that Eleanor had observed in her apartment. "It's trying to re-establish connection," Eleanor said, reaching for the wrapped plate mentioned in Elizabeth's notes. The collapse of Walsh's original camera just redistributed its energy. It's been rebuilding itself all these months. As her fingers touched the wrapping, images flooded her mind. Not memories, but possibilities. Clara smiling in sunshine that never existed in her lifetime. The lost children playing in a meadow unbounded by conventional space. Margaret as a young woman, holding her sister's hand. These weren't phantoms, but glimpses of what existed beyond ordinary perception. What Clara had called the other side of the glass. The camera's humming intensified, the brass fittings vibrating visibly. One of the workers cried out as his shadow separated from his feet, stretching toward the lens with independent movement. "It's casting a wider net," Eleanor warned, not just seeking Clara, but any suitable conduit. Midnight suddenly leapt onto the camera itself, his paws pressing against the wooden body with deliberate precision. His eyes locked with Eleanor's, communicating an unmistakable instruction. Now, with trembling hands, Eleanor unwrapped the final plate. Unlike the others, this one was not glass, but a mirror polished to perfect reflectivity, its surface inscribed with symbols that seemed to move beneath the surface like living things. "It doesn't need to be destroyed," she realized, positioning the mirror before the lens. "It needs to see itself." As Eleanor positioned the mirror before the lens, time seemed to suspend. The attic's dimensions warped slightly, light bending around the camera as though reality itself recognized what was about to happen. The mirror reflected the aperture perfectly, creating an infinite regression. The camera seeing itself, extending toward infinity. "A self-sustaining loop," Eleanor breathed, understanding washing over her. "That's what Elizabeth discovered. The doorway can't be destroyed, only contained by turning its gaze inward." The humming transformed into a high-pitched frequency that made everyone but Midnight cover their ears. The cat remained perfectly still, his paws holding the mirror steady as the camera lens began rotating rapidly, trying to escape its own reflection. "It's working," Catherine whispered, watching as the workers' shadows snapped back to their rightful places. The temperature fluctuated wildly, freezing one moment, uncomfortably warm the next, as the camera fought against its containment. The mirror's surface appeared to liquefy while maintaining its reflective properties, the symbols beneath flowing into new configurations. This was never about destroying doorways, Eleanor realized. It was about responsible guardianship. Elizabeth knew Walsh had discovered something genuine, something that couldn't simply be unmade. Midnight's shadow stretched impossibly large against the attic wall, momentarily taking on Clara's silhouette before returning to feline form. A silent message passed between cat and woman, an understanding that transcended ordinary communication. "The children aren't trapped," Eleanor said with sudden certainty. "They're gatekeepers now." Clara wasn't Walsh's victim but his successor. Elizabeth understood this. Each guardian chooses their vessel. The mirror began absorbing light from the room, creating a localized darkness that paradoxically illuminated the camera with greater clarity. The brass fittings stopped vibrating, the aperture settling into a middle position, neither fully open nor completely closed. A state of equilibrium, Eleanor explained to Catherine, whose expression shifted from fear to fascination. Not dormant, but balanced. As the phenomenon stabilized, Eleanor noticed something extraordinary. Within the mirror's surface, tiny points of light moved in deliberate patterns, like distant stars rearranging themselves. She recognized them immediately. "It's them," she whispered. "The children. They're showing us they're safe." One light burned slightly brighter than the others, pulsing in a pattern that Eleanor instinctively knew was Clara's signature. The communication was brief but unmistakable. Gratitude, reassurance, and a gentle warning rolled into a single impression. When everything finally stilled, the camera appeared ordinary once more, just an antique device without obvious supernatural properties. But Eleanor and Catherine knew better. The mirror had become permanently bonded to the lens, creating a self-contained system that regulated its own doorway. "What happens now?" Catherine asked, gently touching the wooden body that had cooled to normal temperature. Eleanor watched as Midnight jumped down, stretching like an ordinary house cat before sitting to groom himself. "Now we become the new caretakers," she replied. "We maintain the balance. We document. We remember." Outside, the quality of light had returned to normal, but Eleanor's perception had been permanently altered. In every reflection, every shadow, she now recognized the potential for doorways, not with fear, but with wonder and respect for thresholds that had always existed just beyond ordinary sight. Eleanor established a small foundation called the Threshold Trust, operating under the guise of historical photography preservation. Its true purpose remained known only to an inner circle. Catherine Harrington, Dr. Sylvia Mercer, who had recognized the unorthodox techniques in Walsh's work, and reluctantly, James Heller, whose analytical mind proved invaluable despite his initial skepticism. The camera and mirror apparatus remained in a specially designed vault beneath Margaret Harrington's renovated home, which now served as the Trust's headquarters. Monthly monitoring protocols were established, with Eleanor meticulously recording subtle changes in the mirror's reflective surface, how the tiny points of light rearranged themselves in patterns that almost resembled constellations. "The equilibrium requires attention," Eleanor explained during one of their quarterly meetings. "Not interference, just witnessing. The observation itself maintains the balance." Catherine had discovered additional journals hidden throughout her mother's house, revealing that Margaret had been communicating with Clara across the threshold for decades. The sisters had developed their own visual language, patterns of light that conveyed complex concepts without words. "Look at these diagrams," Catherine said, spreading the pages across the table. Margaret was mapping threshold spaces all over the city, places where the boundary naturally thins. The journals identified 23 locations where liminality occurred naturally: a particular bench in the old cemetery, the landing between floors in the public library, a specific corner of the Botanical Gardens Victorian glasshouse. In each location, Margaret had photographed the same black cat over a span of 50 years. Midnight has predecessors, Eleanor realized. The vessel changes, but the essence remains. Her current feline companion watched from the windowsill, tail swishing with apparent approval. The research attracted unwanted attention. Anonymous emails arrived containing photographs of Eleanor's apartment building, surveillance footage of her entering the institute. Dr. Keene called her to his office, expressing concern about her extracurricular activities. "The institute has noticed your frequent visits to the Harrington property," he said carefully. "We have protocols regarding personal retention of research materials." Eleanor maintained her professional demeanor. "I'm providing consulting services for a historical preservation project, nothing related to our restricted materials." But that evening, she found her apartment door slightly ajar. Nothing appeared missing, but Midnight's behavior had changed. He prowled restlessly, refusing to sleep, watching the mirrors with unblinking vigilance. Her phone rang past midnight. James Heller, his voice tight with anxiety. "Someone accessed my secure drive, the one with the Clara files. The trace leads back to a server registered to something called the Vermeer Foundation." Eleanor's blood ran cold. She had encountered this name once in Walsh's journals, contemporaries who pursued similar research but with fundamentally different goals. Where Walsh sought to create doorways between worlds, The Vermeer group sought to control them, to extract what lay beyond for practical applications. "They found us," she whispered, watching as Midnight suddenly stood alert, his eyes reflecting something that wasn't in the room. The cat moved to her bookshelf, deliberately pushing a volume to the floor. Elizabeth Harrington's decoded notes on countermeasures against unwanted observers. "We need to move the camera tonight," Eleanor told James. "They don't just want to study it, they want to use it." Eleanor stood in the rain outside the Harrington estate, her heart pounding as she watched unmarked vehicles circling the block for the third time. The Vermeer Foundation had moved faster than anticipated. Inside, Catherine and James were carefully disconnecting the camera mirror apparatus from its monitoring equipment, preparing for immediate relocation. "They were watching all along," Eleanor whispered to Midnight, who paced anxiously at her feet, "waiting for us to do exactly what Margaret had been preventing for decades, bringing all the pieces together." Her phone vibrated with a text from Dr. Keene. "Institute archives breached. Vermeer representatives claimed federal authorization. They took Walsh's original research." The betrayal stung, but it wasn't unexpected. Institutions prioritized self-preservation over truth. What troubled Eleanor more was how thoroughly the Vermeer Foundation had infiltrated multiple organizations simultaneously, suggesting resources and influence far beyond what she'd imagined. When she returned inside, Catherine was studying a previously overlooked notation in her grandmother's journal. "Look at this. Elizabeth didn't just hide the camera to contain it. She separated it from something called the focusing element." James looked up from his careful packing. "That would explain the equilibrium state. It's incomplete, by design." Eleanor examined the cryptic diagram Elizabeth had drawn, a tripartite system where the camera represented just one component. The mirror was the second. But the third element, the focus, had been deliberately hidden elsewhere. The true power isn't in creating doorways, Eleanor realized. It's in directing them, choosing which realities connect. A distant memory surfaced. Clara's words on that final night. "Document everything, not just to keep records, but because documentation itself was part of the process." Observation shaped reality. Midnight suddenly leapt onto the table, pawing at the leather cover of Margaret's oldest journal. His claws caught on what appeared to be a simple decorative element, revealing a hidden compartment containing a small crystal lens no larger than a thumbnail. "The focusing element," Catherine breathed, reaching for it. "Wait," Eleanor cautioned. "Remember what Clara showed us? Every doorway connects both ways. This isn't just about keeping something contained, it's about protecting what's on both sides." Through the window, headlights swept across the driveway as more vehicles arrived. Time had run out. "I understand now what Walsh never did," Eleanor said, carefully taking the crystal. "The children weren't just conduits or victims. They were chosen because they could see both sides clearly enough to make ethical choices about what should pass between worlds." The crystal warmed in her palm, tiny points of light swirling within its structure, the same constellation patterns they'd observed in the mirror. Not random at all, but a map of connections. "The Vermeer Foundation wants to exploit the doorway," James said, securing the last of their equipment. "To take without consent or understanding." Eleanor slipped the crystal into her locket, the same one that had once held Clara's photograph. "Then we give them an incomplete equation. The camera and mirror without the focus creates observation without direction, a lens that sees everything but connects to nothing." Outside, car doors slammed. Midnight's eyes reflected pinpoints of light that traced a path toward the garden's edge, where Margaret had documented one of the natural threshold spaces decades earlier. The true final guardian hadn't been Clara or Margaret or even Eleanor. It had been the understanding itself, passed from one watcher to another, that some doors are meant to be respected, not forced open. The Vermeer Foundation agents entered the Harrington house with practiced efficiency, but found themselves confronting an unexpected emptiness where their intelligence had indicated the camera would be. Eleanor, Catherine, and James had vanished along with their precious cargo, leaving behind only meaningless research decoys and deliberately misleading notes. What the agents couldn't see was the small group moving through the winter garden behind the property, following Midnight as he navigated with preternatural confidence toward the ancient stone bench Margaret had documented as a natural threshold. The cat's shadow stretched impossibly long in the moonlight, occasionally taking forms that resembled both Clara and other children from the photographs. "They'll track us eventually," James muttered, cradling the mirror-bound camera beneath his coat. "An organization with those resources won't simply give up." Eleanor touched the locket containing the crystal focus. They're searching for something they don't understand. Without this, they have only part of the equation. Catherine stopped suddenly, pointing toward the bench. In the darkness, it seemed to shimmer slightly, its edges less defined than the surrounding garden furniture. Mother used to sit here for hours. I always thought she was simply reminiscing, but she was maintaining contact, wasn't she? The three researchers approached cautiously. Midnight jumped onto the bench, turning in a precise circle 3 times before sitting at its center, his eyes reflecting impossible constellations. The crystal in Eleanor's locket warmed against her skin in response. It's not just about hiding the camera, Eleanor realized. It's about placing it where it belongs, in a natural threshold rather than an artificial one. Walsh's mistake was forcing a doorway where none should exist. As they positioned the camera on the bench beside Midnight, the air around them seemed to thicken with potential. The mirror's surface rippled like disturbed water, the tiny points of light within it moving with greater energy and purpose. "They're aware we're here," Catherine whispered, not specifying who they were. Eleanor carefully removed the crystal from her locket, holding it above the camera without yet connecting the components. "If we complete the system here, at a natural threshold, we're not creating something new. We're acknowledging what already exists." In the distance, flashlight beams cut through the darkness as Vermeer agents began searching the grounds. Time was running out. "What exactly will happen?" James asked, eyeing the crystal with scientific wariness. "Balance," Eleanor answered simply. "Not a doorway forced open, but a window properly framed. Clara and the others found their way through, but there's still a need for watchers on both sides." The decision crystallized in Eleanor's mind with sudden clarity. The role of guardian wasn't about possession or control. It was about understanding and respect. With deliberate care, she placed the focusing crystal into its rightful position within the camera's mechanism. Completing the tripartite system Elizabeth Harrington had wisely separated decades ago. The effect was subtle but profound. No dramatic light show or supernatural display. Simply a perfect settling, as though a room full of slightly tilted pictures had all simultaneously straightened. The camera, mirror, and crystal hummed in harmony for a brief moment before falling silent. Midnight blinked once, deliberately, his eyes now reflecting nothing but ordinary moonlight. His shadow, however, multiplied into several small silhouettes that danced briefly across the garden path before resolving back into a single feline form. "It's done," Eleanor said, knowing with absolute certainty that the camera would now appear entirely ordinary to anyone who lacked the ability to truly see. The camera's transformation left Eleanor, Catherine, and James momentarily breathless as their pursuers' voices grew closer. Eleanor swept her hand over the seemingly ordinary device, feeling a subtle warmth radiating from it. Not mechanical heat, but something more organic, like the body temperature of a living thing. "They won't see what we see," she whispered, gently returning her hand to her side. The truly remarkable aspect of Walsh's discovery wasn't the technology, but the recognition that perception itself creates reality. Only those who know how to look can truly observe. As flashlight beams cut through the garden's darkness, James made a move to collect their equipment, but Catherine stopped him with a gentle hand on his wrist. "Leave it," she said with newfound conviction. "This is where it belongs." Midnight stretched languidly before leaping from the bench to wind between Eleanor's ankles. The cat's eyes, once reflective of impossible geometries, now held only typical feline awareness, yet Eleanor sensed this was a conscious choice rather than a transformation. The Vermeer agents converged on their location, led by a stern-faced woman whose crisp suit seemed impervious to the night's dampness. "Dr. Voss," she acknowledged with a cold smile, "we've been monitoring your unauthorized research for some time. The Institute has agreed to transfer all materials related to the Walsh phenomenon to our custody." Eleanor stood her ground as the woman's gaze fell on the antique camera sitting innocuously on the bench. "Is this it?" The agent's tone conveyed disappointment. "Our intelligence indicated a more substantial apparatus." James stepped forward, his scientific skepticism providing perfect cover. "It's just a period-appropriate replica we've been using for comparative analysis. The original collapsed in on itself months ago, as our reports clearly documented." The agent lifted the camera, examining it with clinical detachment. To her eyes, it appeared to be nothing more than an antique photographic device. Well-preserved, but utterly ordinary. The mirror showed only normal reflections, the crystal focus invisible to those who didn't know to look for it. "Search their belongings," she instructed her team. "Check the house again." As the agents dispersed, Eleanor felt a subtle pressure against her ankle. Midnight, pressing deliberately against her leg, guiding her backward a single step. In that moment, she understood what Margaret had been doing all those years on this bench, not just observing the threshold, but standing precisely at its edge, where perception itself becomes fluid. When the agent turned back to face them, her expression briefly faltered. For just an instant, she seemed to perceive something beyond the three researchers, shadows that didn't quite match their sources, movements where nothing was moving. "There's nothing here," she finally concluded, returning the camera to the bench with unconcealed frustration. "False intelligence. We'll reconvene at headquarters." As the agents departed, Catherine exhaled slowly. They couldn't see it. "More importantly," Eleanor replied, watching Midnight settle comfortably on the bench beside the camera, "they couldn't see them." In the gentle moonlight, faint silhouettes temporarily materialized around the bench. Children from different eras gathered in silent observation. Among them, Clara stood with her hand resting protectively on the camera, her smile both ancient and youthful. The watchers had never abandoned their post. They had simply been waiting for someone who knew how to see them. The midsummer sun painted long shadows across the lawn of the Barrett Institute's annual reception, where Eleanor found herself reluctantly mingling with colleagues who had long since dismissed her peculiar research interests. Dr. Keene approached with calculated casualness, champagne flute in hand. "The Vermeer Foundation has withdrawn all inquiries about the Walsh materials," he mentioned, studying her reaction. "Rather abruptly, I might add. Something about insufficient evidence of anomalous properties." Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. "Perhaps they realized old photographs aren't worth corporate espionage." "Perhaps." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Though their lead investigator has taken indefinite leave. Something about recurring nightmares and requesting transfer to their data analysis department." A slight smile touched Eleanor's lips before she could suppress it. The threshold had its own ways of protecting itself. Later that evening, Eleanor sat in her study surrounded by Margaret Harrington's journals, with Midnight curled contentedly in her lap. The final piece of the puzzle had revealed itself through careful cross-referencing, a pattern she should have recognized months earlier. Walsh hadn't discovered how to create doorways between worlds. He had stumbled upon the revelation that doorways already existed everywhere, maintained by natural guardians who operated beyond human perception. His mistake was attempting to mechanize and control what was inherently organic and balanced. The truth lay in the dates Elizabeth Harrington had meticulously recorded in her countermeasures journal. Each corresponded exactly to the death of a natural guardian and the birth of their successor, a child with the ability to see beyond ordinary reality. Clara hadn't been Walsh's victim, but the next guardian in an ancient lineage, chosen by the previous watchkeeper. Walsh's camera hadn't created a supernatural doorway, but rather revealed the guardians already maintaining the natural thresholds between worlds. By attempting to control these passages, he had disrupted the transfer of guardianship, trapping Clara in a liminal state. Elizabeth Harrington hadn't merely protected her daughter. She had recognized Clara's true purpose and ensured the guardianship could eventually continue through its proper channels. Margaret had spent her life maintaining the balance until another suitable guardian could be identified. Eleanor's fingers traced the final entry in Margaret's journal, written in shaky hand just days before her death. "She's arrived at last. The new watcher with eyes that truly see. Not my blood, but the right spirit. The cat will find her." Understanding washed over Eleanor like a gentle wave. Her lifelong ability to see patterns others missed. Her inexplicable connection to Clara's photograph. Even her dreams. They weren't coincidences or professional curiosity. They were recognition signals between an outgoing guardian and her successor. Midnight's purring intensified as Eleanor closed the journal, finally accepting what she had always known but never acknowledged. She wasn't just documenting the thresholds, she was born to maintain them. The cat's eyes met hers with ancient recognition as the shadows in her study briefly shifted, revealing countless silhouettes of previous guardians stretching back through centuries, all nodding in acknowledgement of the truth. Eleanor found herself transformed by the knowledge of her true purpose as guardian. The ordinary world continued around her. She still cataloged photographs at the Institute, still paid her bills, still appeared to colleagues as the somewhat eccentric Dr. Voss with her curious black cat. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, she inhabited a profoundly different reality. Each morning began with her sitting quietly on the bench in what had been Margaret's garden, now her own, since Catherine had insisted Eleanor take possession of the family home. "It belongs to the Watcher, not the bloodline," Catherine had explained, revealing how Margaret had arranged everything in her will years before Eleanor had even encountered Clara's photograph. The garden bench had become Eleanor's observation post. She would sit, midnight curled beside her, and simply witness the subtle movements of the threshold. Some days the air would shimmer slightly. Other days, shadows would fall at impossible angles. Occasionally, visitors would appear, translucent figures from distant times or places, acknowledging her with solemn nods before continuing their journeys. Dr. Sylvia Mercer had become a cautious ally, visiting weekly to document the subtle changes in the camera's appearance. "It adapts to who's looking at it," she observed, photographing how the brass fittings seemed to shift configuration between observations. "It's almost as if it's watching us back," Eleanor completed her thought. Observation goes both ways. James had retreated somewhat from direct involvement, his scientific mind still struggling to reconcile what he had witnessed. He continued analyzing data remotely but avoided the bench and its anomalies. "I'm better as the skeptic," he had admitted. "Someone needs to maintain objective distance." The Vermeer Foundation had not entirely abandoned their pursuit. Their direct approaches had ceased, but Eleanor occasionally noticed unfamiliar cars parked too long on her street, or found evidence of attempted digital intrusions into her research files. They were watching, waiting, perhaps hoping she would eventually reveal something they had missed. Most profound was Eleanor's evolving relationship with Midnight, who was clearly more than an ordinary cat. She had begun to understand why felines had been associated with mysticism throughout human history. Midnight moved effortlessly between states of being, sometimes a simple house cat demanding treats, other times a knowing guide who would lead her to previously unnoticed threshold points throughout the city. In quiet moments, Eleanor would catch glimpses of Clara and the other children reflected in mirrors or polished surfaces, always watching, always present in the liminal spaces between perception and reality. They weren't trapped or lost. They were exactly where they needed to be, fulfilling their roles as watchers from the other side of the threshold. "The true power isn't in opening doors," Eleanor wrote in her own Guardian journal, beginning the documentation that would someday guide her successor. "It's in understanding when they should remain closed, when they should be left ajar, and who should be permitted to pass through. Balance isn't static. It requires constant, conscious adjustment." The knowledge weighed on her, not as a burden, but as a profound responsibility. Each threshold represented potential for wonder or terror, discovery or destruction, and the difference often came down to nothing more than the intention of the observer. Eleanor established a tradition of monthly visits to the 23 natural threshold locations Margaret had documented throughout the city. Each site appeared mundane to casual observers. An alcove in the public library, a particular park bench, the landing between floors in the old courthouse. Yet Eleanor now perceived their true significance as junctures where reality thinned slightly, where watchful eyes from elsewhere could peer through. She carried Clara's photograph, the original, not the Institute's sealed copy, in a special case lined with materials that blocked its properties from detection. The image had changed subtly since that night at the garden bench. Clara's expression now showed peaceful awareness rather than solemn concern, and Midnight, still rigid in her arms, now seemed less a prisoner and more a willing participant in their shared guardianship. The photograph was never the doorway itself, Eleanor explained to Catherine during tea in the garden. It was a record of recognition, one watcher acknowledging another across time and perception. Catherine nodded, having grown comfortable with these impossible truths. Mother always said photographs were never just records of what was, but glimpses of what continues to be. I thought it was sentimental nonsense. The Vermeer Foundation made one final attempt at intervention. A formal job offer for Eleanor with an astronomical salary and promises of unlimited research resources. The crisp corporate letterhead couldn't disguise the subtle threat beneath. Join us or be considered an obstacle. Eleanor's response was a single photograph mailed to their headquarters, an ordinary Polaroid of her garden bench that, to the right eyes, would reveal dozens of watchful guardians gathered protectively around the threshold. The Foundation's surveillance ceased entirely the following day. James eventually reconciled his scientific worldview with what he had witnessed, publishing a groundbreaking paper on perceptual relativity and documentary imagery, that revolutionized photographic analysis without ever directly revealing the truth about thresholds. His work ensured that future researchers might recognize the signs without needing to force the doorways. Dr. Sylvia Mercer became the Trust's historical anchor, meticulously documenting the lineage of previous guardians through photographic evidence dating back to the earliest daguerreotypes. Her research revealed patterns of guardianship stretching across continents and centuries. Children with particular gifts, often paired with feline companions, appearing precisely when and where they were needed. On the anniversary of Clara's final crossing, Eleanor sat at the garden bench with Midnight beside her. The camera remained in its place, appearing to casual observers as nothing more than a vintage curiosity, while continuing its true work of maintaining balanced observation between worlds. As twilight descended, Eleanor felt a familiar presence beside her. Though invisible to ordinary sight, she knew Clara had joined her vigil. "We don't close the doors," Eleanor whispered to the gathering darkness. "We ensure they open correctly, and only for those who understand their true purpose." Midnight stretched, his shadow momentarily taking the shape of a small girl before returning to feline form, a reminder that guardianship passed from hand to hand, eye to eye, across the generations, but the watchers themselves remained eternally present in the careful observation of those with eyes to truly see. The seasons turned as Eleanor settled fully into her role as guardian. Autumn painted the garden in amber and crimson, leaves spiraling down to rest around the bench that had become the center of her vigil. Winter brought silent snowfalls that coated the threshold in pristine white, somehow never accumulating on the camera itself, which remained untouched by frost or moisture. Eleanor continued her work at the Barrett Institute, now serving as department head after Dr. Keene's unexpected retirement. Her new position allowed her to subtly influence which photographs received attention and which remained safely archived, particularly those containing reflective surfaces that might serve as unintentional apertures. On a crisp spring morning, as cherry blossoms drifted across the garden, Eleanor noticed something extraordinary in her guardian journal. The handwriting on the most recent pages wasn't entirely her own. Subtle variations appeared mid-sentence, flourishes and patterns reminiscent of Elizabeth Harrington's script, occasionally shifting to Margaret's more practical hand, even briefly showing Clara's childish loops. "Collective memory," she whispered to Midnight, who watched her with knowing eyes. "The guardianship isn't just past, it's shared across time." That evening, reviewing the journal by lamplight, she discovered a message woven through the collaborative text. "The cycle completes. The watchers gather. The threshold awakens fully at centenary." Eleanor calculated quickly. Exactly 100 years had passed since Walsh's disappearance, a century since Clara had first been caught between worlds. The date was approaching within days. As if responding to her realization, the photographs throughout her study began to change. Not in their physical properties, but in what they revealed upon careful observation. Every reflective surface, eyes, mirrors, water, now showed the same scene, guardians from different eras gathering around a central point of light. "It's not an ending," Eleanor told Catherine when she arrived breathless with her own observations of photographs changing throughout the Harrington archives. "It's a convergence." Midnight grew increasingly alert as the centenary approached, spending hours watching the camera on the bench, his tail twitching with precise, almost mathematical patterns. The crystal focus within the device pulsed with subtle luminescence that only Eleanor could perceive, a beacon calling across dimensional boundaries. On the eve of the 100th anniversary, Eleanor sat in the garden as twilight descended. The air around the bench shimmered with potential, the barrier between worlds growing translucent enough that she could perceive shadowy figures gathering on the other side. Clara at their center, surrounded by children from different eras, all with the same watchful intensity in their eyes. "Tomorrow," Eleanor whispered, understanding flowing through her like a current. "The centenary isn't just a milestone. It's when the observers on both sides can fully communicate." Midnight leapt into her lap, purring with unusual intensity. When Eleanor looked into his eyes, she saw not just reflections but windows, glimpses of what waited beyond ordinary perception. The cat had never been merely a companion or even a conduit. He was the constant, the eternal guardian taking different forms across time. As darkness fell completely, Eleanor made her preparations. The threshold would open fully tomorrow, not as a breach or disruption, but as the completion of a cycle, A moment when guardians from both sides could stand together and renew the natural order that Walsh had accidentally discovered and attempted to manipulate. The Watchers were coming home. The morning of the centenary dawned with unusual stillness. Eleanor walked to the garden bench where Midnight already sat beside the camera, his posture regal and expectant. The apparatus remained visibly unchanged, yet radiated an unmistakable presence, like a heart about to beat after long dormancy. Throughout the day, Eleanor felt reality growing increasingly permeable around her. Reflective surfaces throughout the house, windows, mirrors, even spoons at breakfast, momentarily showed impossible angles, as if every potential threshold was responding to the anniversary. At precisely 3:17 in the afternoon, the exact time Walsh's studio had closed 100 years earlier, Eleanor took her place on the bench with Midnight beside her. The camera's aperture adjusted itself without human intervention, focusing on something beyond ordinary sight. The air before them seemed to fold gently inward, creating not a doorway but a window where two realities became temporarily visible to each other. Through this opening, Eleanor saw Clara clearly, surrounded by other guardian children whose photographs she had studied. Beyond them stretched a landscape of impossible architecture and gentle luminescence, not an afterlife or alternate dimension, but the observer's reality, the place where Watchers maintained their eternal vigil. "We've been waiting," Clara said, her voice carrying perfectly despite the dimensional separation. "Every 100 years, the cycle allows full communion between guardian realms. What was fractured by Walsh's interference can be properly aligned today." Eleanor understood then that guardianship wasn't merely passed from one Watcher to another. It was simultaneously maintained from both sides of perception. The camera hadn't created a doorway but had revealed the natural communion that had always existed. Clara stepped forward until she stood at the very edge of the threshold, Midnight's counterpart, a black cat with identical markings mirroring her movements. "The photograph that began your journey wasn't just an image of me. It was a moment when both sides were briefly visible to each other." Eleanor felt tears gathering as Clara's small hand reached out, not crossing the threshold but resting against its surface. She placed her own hand opposite, feeling not touch but unmistakable connection. "We don't need to cross over," Eleanor whispered in understanding. "We need to see each other clearly." Clara nodded, her smile radiant with approval. "That's always been the true purpose. Not passage, but recognition." The gathered children on Clara's side each raised their hands in unison, revealing identical lockets containing fragments of the same focusing crystal. The scattered pieces of Walsh's original apparatus had never been destroyed, merely distributed among the guardians to ensure no single entity could control all thresholds. As the afternoon light began to fade, the window between worlds gently closed, not with finality, but with the promise of future convergence. Eleanor knew her guardianship would continue, watching and documenting, maintaining balance between observation and interference. That evening, she developed a photograph she had taken during the communion. The image showed the bench, the camera, and herself, but also, visible only to those with eyes to truly see, Clara and the other guardians standing in perfect alignment with their counterparts. Eleanor placed this photograph in an album marked simply "Continuity," alongside the original image of Clara holding Midnight. The first had revealed a doorway. The second confirmed a partnership that transcended dimensional boundaries. Another photograph, another dark secret revealed. Until next time, this has been Shadow Frames.